Well, this is a bit of self-promo, I suppose. 3 years ago we did a story for Granada Television, God bless them, and it was a 40-minute documentary called Back to the Front. And the idea was, over this series, we did about 8 of them, was to use archive because it was cheap and it belonged to us, but also to go back to these places and see what they were like today. So you had this kind of juxtaposition of 30 years back and then what's it like today. And we did it in about eight or 9 places. And this was in Vietnam. I first went there in '68 and was among the last to come out in '75. It's only about 8 minutes. I mean, the whole thing was 40 minutes, but I think the reason Flora selected this chunk is because you think it raises some of the issues that we hope you will be discussing tonight. Is that enough? Great.
For me, perhaps the most frightening experience here was my first. Being on board an American river patrol boat searching out the enemy that might be hiding along the banks. Or an enemy transporting weapons in the barges and sampans. Now, without over-dramatizing things, can you imagine what it was like then to be coming down these inlets and tributaries of the Saigon River and the Mekong, expecting to be shot? Every movement in the bush was a Viet Cong sniper. Every twist in the river was an ambush. I was terrified, absolutely terrified. I thought I was in the wrong business because everybody else on board, from the staff sergeant who was steering right up to the guys up front, looked very relaxed, very calm. But then I noticed that they were, every now and again, slipping pills into their mouth. And I realized that I was the only guy on board who wasn't using drugs. Well, maybe it helped. Men told me that when you're high on drugs, you feel invulnerable, way above it. Or maybe that's why so many men died in these firefights, men who might have taken cover quicker. Who knows? Losing on land, struggling on water, only in the air were the Americans invincible. In the words of one American general, the giant B-52s were bombing much of Vietnam back to the Stone Age. Each aircraft dropped their 60 tons of high explosive in what was called carpet bombing. The idea was to destroy roads and bridges the communists were using, bringing men and supplies south under the cover of the vast forests. B-52s or no B-52s, still they came. To deny them that jungle cover, the Americans simply took the forests away. They sprayed them with a defoliant codenamed Agent Orange because that was its colour. In all, they used over 20 million gallons of the stuff that turned the jungle below into a wasteland, into a moonscape. But it didn't matter. The communists found other routes and still they came. On June the 8th, 1972, a South Vietnamese pilot flying an American plane dropped napalm on a village just north of Saigon. Napalm had been used many times before, but today it was different. The picture of a little girl with skin melting off her back shocked the world. The image became powerful communist propaganda and something of an icon for those campaigning for peace in Vietnam. I met Kim Phuc 13 years after that. She had endured many operations and extensive plastic surgery, but was suffering even then.
Lúc nào em cũng nhớ hết, không bao giờ em quên được. I can never forget that day. I carry it with me on my back. The war had been all around me since I was born, but that day, it came to me. I've often thought about the people who did it, but I can't blame the Americans, because it was an American doctor who saved my life. They say I was dying when I got to hospital, but he made me live again. Now I try hard to forget, but when I'm tired and when it's hot, my burns pain again and I can't sleep. I can't even think properly when they hurt. Life is unbearable when it's hot. I'm only sad when I see my friends who never have pain. That's my ambition, never to have pain again.
Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh was now the cry on every campus, in every university, in nearly every city worldwide. The campaign to end the war was fast gathering momentum. Jane Fonda lost her screen popularity but found new friends as a leading critic of the war.
We have realized the fatality of racism. It is easier to slaughter Vietnamese people when they are thought of not as human beings, but as gooks and slopes.
And that's what we're here for, to voice our dissent and to say we don't approve of the killing, and they're not doing it in the name of America because we're Americans.
But dissent, let's get out of this war now, had spread even to the battlefields in Vietnam itself.
I try to stay out of much violence as I can. I think it's bad to have to kill women and children. We don't want to hit contact.
I don't really think that there is going to be another generation of American soldier. I think that people are just tired of it.
President Kennedy has sent his GIs to the war. President Johnson had kept them there. Now, President Nixon promised to bring them home and without further loss of American blood. But to do that, he was prepared to bomb the communists into agreeing to his terms. On the 26th of December 1972, Hanoi, the communists' northern capital, was blitzed for the first time. Nixon ordered his Air Force to drop over 100,000 bombs. It was called the Boxing Day Blitz, and it lasted 11 days and 11 nights. It did the trick. The Americans got their peace, but this was no victory for them. This was their way out of a war they at last realized they couldn't win. They had been humbled. On the 15th of January 1973, military operations against North Vietnam ceased, and by the end of March, the last GI was on his way home. It was goodbye, Vietnam. With the Americans gone, it was left to the army they had trained to replace them. Now it was up to the South Vietnamese to defend themselves. But they knew, as the Americans knew, as we who were watching knew, that this was the beginning of the end. The communists were unstoppable. What we were watching now was just a holding operation.
This is the first time we've been up Highway 13. That was an airstrike. First time we've been up on this road for the last week. The South Vietnamese have moved no further forward, but it's some comfort at least to see that they've moved no further back.
Right, well, come on, lads, let's go forward. Front of the attack. In the 70s, we all had sideburns, by the way, and long hair. Go on, Jack. I think we thought of ourselves as young lions once. Look at us now. This is Patrick Chavon, a very, very famous and a great veteran photographer who I remember well in Vietnam. was one of the great friends, one mutual friend of ours, Michel Laurent, who was killed 2 days just before the war ended. Jack Lawrence, spelled with a U, CBS, and once ABC, probably has spent more time in Vietnam than most people I know. I mean, he just didn't go in and out the way some of us did. He would sometimes spend months up front. And those scars, Jack, there's none that show. Jon Swain was the youngest correspondent in Vietnam. He was 20 years old when he went there. He had a lot of hair in those days.
It was very long.
20 years old. So that's our little team. I'm supposed to be the moderator, so I should be sitting in the middle, but I'm not. But Flora's asked me just to kind of launch it off by telling you, and we're all going to do it in turn, what it was like to be in Vietnam in those days. And because my memory fails me, I'm going to do a little bit of reading. I'm going to read out a couple of things just to show you how things have not changed. Let me just read you a couple of quotes that I got out of Philip Knightley's book, which has got to be the great testament on journalism, The First Casualty. I'm sure you will know it. Those of you who haven't got it ought to buy it tomorrow, because it is the last will and testament of every decent journalist in the business. This is written by Philip Gibbs, who was a Daily Telegraph correspondent, and a fiver for anyone who can guess when it was written or said. We're being throttled by the military. We are so desperate for news that we're willing to report any scrap of information, any glimmer of truth, any rumor, fairy tale or lie, if it fills the vacuum.
1914.
You've been reading my notes.
No, I didn't. I just happened to know that.
Right.
They arrested him. They put him in jail.
Yeah, that's Philip Gibbs of all those years ago.
Deported him from France.
93 years ago he wrote that. The same year, I'll just take this away from you. The same year, Prime Minister David Lloyd George told C.P. Snow, who was editor of the Manchester Guardian, that if the British public knew what was going on in the trenches, the war would end tomorrow. And this is his quote. He said to C.P. Snow, but of course they don't know and they shan't know. The correspondent will not write and the censor will not pass the truth. Now, 65 years on, during the Falklands, which I helped to cover as a pressman, 1982, Sir John Fieldhouse, Commander-in-Chief during the Falklands War, said this. He told me this. The press were bloody inconvenient. If I'd had my way, I'd have told nobody there was a war going on until it was all over. And then I'd simply told them who'd won. So that has been what I would call a state of war that has frequently existed between us and them. Now, there'll be guys tonight who will tell you that it's not always so. Vietnam was a rather special place. It was special for all of us. Michael Herr, in his great book, Dispatches, said being in Vietnam was like sitting within the petal of a poisonous flower. And I think we can understand what he meant by that. It was such a large war that it overwhelmed us. You couldn't come to any conclusions. It was something so big and so complex that I think it bewildered us for most of the time, especially for television people who try to compress a day in the war in 200 words, 1 minute 15. It was a war. Flora said in her email to me that it was the first time that the public had seen the brutality of war and the consequences of war among civilians on television, which is not true. The very first war that did that for the world's public was Biafra. And I think there are too many people here tonight who are too young to remember Biafra. But Biafra was the very first time that the brutality of war was brought into the comfort of people's front parlours. And if you remember, Marshal McLuhan said that the war in Vietnam was won not on the battlefields of Vietnam, but in the homes of Americans. So I think most of what I want to say, I think I've said. We mustn't think that the censorship that we've suffered since Vietnam is necessarily a consequence of the freedom that we all enjoyed in Vietnam, because, and I think John will disagree with me, although we were allowed access and encouraged to go almost everywhere in Vietnam, we were taxied to the war in Huey in our favorite helicopters. There was a far more subtle censorship which has been employed ever since by governments all over, and that is the censorship of spin. Although we were allowed to go places, the spin machine that was being employed by the Americans both inside Vietnam and outside in Washington and elsewhere was so well orchestrated, so professional, that I think it outmatched their military machine. And I don't think at the time that we were quite aware of how so perfectly oiled the American propaganda machine was. Anyway, I've said my bit. Only to say that the other quote from Michael Herr that I always remember is that people who remember Vietnam should forget it, and those who've forgotten it should remember it. Typically cryptic Michael Herr. So let me open with you. You've always got things to say. You say the first things.
Well,
your time in Vietnam.
Well, I'll take up with the other great quote from Michael Herr, which was Vietnam was an adventure playground for journalists. And I confess, having arrived there at a very young age, that was exactly what it was for me, and it was exhilarating and exciting, and I make no apologies for that. That's what young men do. And it took a while for me to realize and appreciate, I think, fully, as I matured a bit, the carnage that was going on around. I mean, but reporting it as a journalist, it was my very first war, apart from a little conflict in Chad, in Africa, with the French, which I couldn't get near. I arrived, and it was there. It was there on your doorstep. You could hear it rattling the windows of your hotel or your flat in Saigon. You could see the flares at night across the Saigon River.
Benoit.
All of that. It was you could sense in this frenzied, chaotic city with its beggars and but also sort of extraordinary frenzied excitement as well, particularly if you were, just back from the field, where you used to go out in the field and you'd come back and you could eat wonderful French food and all that sort of thing. I'm being very
were you astonished, John, at the freedom the Americans gave you? You only had to say to a press information officer, "I want to go there," and the next morning he'd put you in a helicopter and you were sent there. Did that astonish you?
It did. I mean, I started off in Cambodia first of all, which was slightly different because there were no helicopters there, and you went to the front line in cars. When I got to Vietnam, a few months later, I found yes, it was absolutely possible to just get on a helicopter, and if someone wasn't going to send you, you just got yourself out to the chopper field at 6:30 in the morning when the choppers being prepared, winding up to go on some operation, and you catch the lift. I mean, it wasn't necessary to ask to a press affairs officer, "Can I go on that trip?" If you got to the chopper ground at the right time, you'd ask the crew chief where he was going, and then he said he was going somewhere, and that sounded vaguely interesting, and you would take your day as it came, and you would hop from one landing zone to another.
Patrick, that was the kind of experience we all had.
Yeah, and it was very easy to work in Vietnam for me too. I had to invent the name of a newspaper when I was at the press conference, because I was working for nobody. I was 18.
You were 18?
Yeah.
He beat you.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
And so I just, they called me the expendable frog. So I had quite a lot of work, And they put me in a helicopter, and when the Americans knew I was French, they asked me a lot of questions on the Indochina War, which I said I wasn't really there. I was like 10 years old when it happened. So. But I lied. And I said I was there, and I invented stories about the Indochina glorious, French army. So they tried to do better than the French in front of me so I could take great pictures.
Did your French help you among the Vietnamese?
Not at all. Not at all. Maybe on the communist side, some guys spoke French, but on the South Vietnamese army, no, not really. Some of the officers, but no, it didn't help. What helped is our young age. I thought I was invincible, I was having a lot of fun, and the American soldiers were my age. So we were talking about women and cars, and it was cool. At first, then, your personal life, suddenly you realize that you're doing a real job, you're doing something, but not immediately. It took a North Vietnamese prisoner for me to do that. I used to fall a lot in the jungle, get my foot on I don't know how you say, une racine, and I would fall,
Crevice, yeah.
And I said merde, and this prisoner said, "You're French," because I said shit in French. So he said, I said yes. And he started talking to me about France and all this, and he had studied at the Sorbonne. And so I was astonished that the enemy had even a brain or a voice, so I started talking with him. And he said that my friends were going to execute him. And I was shocked. I said, of course, the South Vietnamese and the Americans don't execute prisoners. But they did execute him.
Sure.
Because we had to move on, and we couldn't bring all the prisoners along. So the South Vietnamese took him on the side and shot him. That day I realized I was a reporter.
Two young men, 18 and 20, and of course, the older ones, slightly older ones among us, used to look upon these guys as kind of war junkies. And there were a number of war junkies there. I mean,
right.
Very famous one. Michael Herr could be Tim Page was another war junkie, Dana Stone, Sean Flynn. Some of that movie, by the way, no, it probably wasn't in this section, but part of the documentary is Sean Flynn's film. He used to give us little rolls of silent footage, which they used to take these tremendous risks, these guys, and they used to wear bandanas around their head. They always had that familiar smell of that banned drug about them. The last time I saw Dana Stone and Errol Flynn, Sean Flynn, they were driving out of Phnom Penh on two motorbikes. And they were never seen again. If I can just, and I want to talk to Jack about this because I know he's got some grown-up thoughts about it. Tim Page, as you know, was injured many, many times, and a British publisher asked him to write a book to once and for all take the glamour out of war. And Page replies, and I quote him, "Take the glamour out of war? How the hell do you do that? You can't take the glamour out of a tank burning or a helicopter blowing up. It's like taking the glamour out of sex. War is good for you." Now that was the kind of attitude that so many of these guys had, didn't they? And you knew most of them.
Only a pothead could say something as ridiculous as that. And God love him, Tim has his sweet side, and I saw that as his friend. But Tim liked to see the world through glazed stone eyes, and that's his choice. If you want me to talk about it, Tim and Dana didn't smoke, didn't touch drugs. He'd have a beer once in a while. He was one of the sanest people I know, and one of the bravest. He was a still photographer and took some classic photographs. Sean was more like Tim. They were practically brothers. The point about it is that if you've never been in the military, and if you have not achieved a certain distinction as a reporter or a photographer, Vietnam was the place to go. And what you saw there as a neophyte were amazing acts of heroism and cowardice and transformations of people in battle. and toys. I mean, what Tim is talking about are the toys of war, the guns. And in the house where Tim and Sean and Dana and others lived in Saigon, in that period from 1963 until about 1968 or so, and then on Tudo Street, they had guns all over the place, you know, hanging from the walls and war trophies of one kind or another. Here's one story to illustrate why some reporters and photographers were so avidly fascinated by being in Vietnam and all of the weapons of war. And we're still capable of some humanity. And I think of them as humans and sensitive ones. Flynn comes back from a month with the Marines or the Special Forces or what have you, and he's got a hand grenade, and he's taking it apart, right? And he says, "This is the new short fuse grenade." So and there it is. It's, you know, it's all, you know, 6 pieces on the floor and the powder and all of the rest of it. He took it apart like an expert, and then he looks up at the rest of us, whose jaws had dropped, and says, "This is the new short fuse grenade. They're trying it out on the Marines. You pull the pin and it goes off behind your ear." That was considered great gallows humor in the group that Tim Page used to hang around with. So such a comment makes sense in that context.
But Tim Page in one of his books says that during the Battle of Hue, he actually said, when there was crossfire, he said to the Marine, "Give me cover while I run," which is straight out of a movie, isn't it? And that's how they talked, these guys. That's how they talked. I mean, it was fun for them.
I think it was fun for a short while.
Mm.
I don't believe it was fun for so long. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't in that group. I lived at Cité La Reynière. I don't know if you remember that place. It was behind the cathedral in Saigon. And I was living with a priest.
Oh dear.
So he was the only one wearing a dress. And the food was free, but that was it. You know? And but if you wanted to change money or buy a gun, he was the man.
Yes.
But I had conversations with him when I came back. I couldn't get into the group thing, you know. So he was an old French priest, and he was talking about war in a different way, trying to pull me down, getting my adrenaline down all the time.
I mentioned Biafra early on, and Biafra had the same effect on that generation of journalists as Vietnam has had on.
It wasn't that. It was simultaneously, though, right? I mean, Biafra was 67.
Well, it's 67, 68, yeah. But it affected people the same way. They found it very hard, as some of people we know, maybe we are among them, who find it very hard to protect, contain, disguise, lie about their compassion, and to separate one's compassion away from reporting, simple reporting. And Jack, I know you had this problem. You've told me about it.
I got accused in the press of being too compassionate in my reports on CBS. You, no matter how hardened you become by the horrors of war, or whatever you want to call it, by the terrible nature of fighting and what it does to people, you cannot. In my case, you cannot not feel sympathy for someone who's hurt, whether it's a wounded enemy soldier or one of your own or a Vietnamese civilian or another journalist. You know, you do everything in your power at that moment to help them, and then you write about it later in some form or other, or you take the pictures and see that they get transmitted to the world. If I can go to the heart of what I think Vietnam has taught us, and there are many lessons, Vietnam and Cambodia especially, it's that the United States, like France before it, went to war with this colonialist attitude and arrogance, just supreme arrogance that they would prevail regardless of how determined the other side was to achieve whatever it was. In the case of the Vietnamese, it was their nationhood, you know, their an end to foreign domination of one kind or another. And in that context, the American press was welcomed by the military and civilian administrations in Saigon, not so much by the Vietnamese in the South, but definitely by the soldiers and their hierarchy. It developed over the years, especially after 63 and 64, thanks to some superb reporting by people like David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan and others, into a contest of wills. The will of the journalist was to report the truth as accurately, or what passed for the truth, as the facts as accurately as they could. And the military was trying to present the war in terms as favorable to itself as possible. Okay, so the indirect censorship and all of the lying that went on.
If I could just interrupt, in the early days, much of the American press were very supportive of the war. They didn't question the foreign policy, America's foreign policy. I mean, they were very supportive, very partisan, the American press, up till about 1968, 69. And they didn't question foreign policy. They simply talked about tactics and, you know, how long will it take to win.
It's hard to support a war when you see your fellow citizens in uniform being gunned down at an amazing rate that wasn't being widely reported. In 1965, the first great battles between the North Vietnamese and the Americans were fought. It's known as the Ia Drang Valley Campaign. And some of you may have seen that wonderful movie called We Were Soldiers Once. I say wonderful movie. It was a pretty good movie, okay? And it was a fairly honest movie. And Joe Galloway, who was the only reporter with that battalion at the time, said it's about 80% factually correct and 20% Hollywood. In any case, what Americans didn't find out at the time was that its sister battalion, the one that was sent in to relieve the one in the movie, was ambushed the next day, and out of 550 soldiers, 155 were killed that day. Can you imagine casualties like that taking place today in any of America's foreign wars, in Afghanistan or Iraq? So we come to the second great lesson of the Vietnam War. Even though that was covered up at the time, it has emerged in history books, you know, as one of the battles the Americans didn't win. Generals are fond of saying, and some revisionist historians are fond of saying, that America never lost a battle in Vietnam. That's never been true, you know, and only a small minority of reporters know that not to be true. It's such a glib phrase. It rolls so easily off the tongue. We never lost a battle, but we lost plenty of battles. And the second great lesson is that unless the policymakers in Washington understand the first lesson, which is the American public will make up its own mind over time, given a free press and the ability to cover a war as accurately as possible, we will continue to get into wars in which we suffer.
We're already in two wars. We've just lost one, and we're already halfway through losing the second one. I mean, the situations in Afghanistan resemble very much the situation in early Vietnam, where you're fighting a guerrilla force with mass armament.
But look at the difference in casualties. I mean, as Jack was just saying, I mean, at the height of the American war in Vietnam, the Americans were losing 400 soldiers a week. You know, I mean, that's you compare that to the casualties in Afghanistan Iraq. For those sort of casualties, the Americans would have left.
No, my point was that the Americans are fighting the war in Afghanistan in a very similar way to the one they tried to fight in Vietnam. And you can't fight guerrillas in this way, can you? Afghanistan is a kind of repeat of what we saw in the early days of Vietnam. Say no and make an argument of it.
There are clear similarities, but you don't have the. I'll preface this by saying, the Afghan campaign is heading south. I quite agree, but they have not reinforced in the way that the generals wanted to reinforce.
Can I just pick up Jack's point about? Everyone knows about the 4 o'clock follies in Saigon. It was a great fuss. And most of the problem with no censorship in Vietnam was nobody had actually talked freely to you. They didn't know what the guidelines were, and therefore it was very difficult to talk to anybody on a one-to-one basis. They'd always say, well, you better go and talk to the public relations office or whatever. But in television, it was impossible for us to get under the surface. Television can never get under the skin.
Michael, I'll give you your argument on that.
But
I'll definitely give you your
let
argument.
him punch me first.
I think you had to be American.
It was people like John who were the feature writers, the guys who could write in thousands of words, other than in television in hundreds of words, that could actually tell the public that most of what was being given to us in Vietnam was a load of balls.
You had to be American to get the real information, I think.
I think that's true. I also think there's so much that we miss, quite clearly. We talk about this enormous freedom we had to roam over the country and get on helicopters and go and see battles and all of that. And yet, it took months before the My Lai massacre came out. There are all sorts of atrocious things that went on, which we never reported.
It took 1 year. Of all those journalists in Vietnam, it took 1 year before we discovered the Americans were in Cambodia.
Yeah.
1 year.
And here in Iraq, here with the Iraq War, you have a different situation where that famous incident, which has gone around the world now, of the helicopter gunship hunting down civilians in Iraq, including 2 journalists, and then shooting up the ambulance that came in to pick them up. It's gone around the world, and that's very recently after it happened.
You're going to take issue.
It was possible to get beneath the surface in Vietnam, and we did, and many reporters and photographers did.
How did you do
My favorite television documentary, my favorite film on the Vietnam War was made by Pierre Schoendorfer, who I'm sorry isn't here tonight, but
he was supposed to come, yeah.
Yeah, he was invited, anyway, he went and spent 6 weeks living with a platoon headed by an African-American lieutenant called Anderson. Yeah. And in 6 weeks, he was able to get well beneath the surface and on top of the surface. It was a black and white documentary, ran 30 minutes on CBS. It was called The Anderson Platoon. And you can get it on eBay, or you can get a newer version of it on eBay. And at other times, if you were in a place that was being so badly shelled, or the soldiers had been in constant combat for weeks and weeks at a time and were exhausted, and you showed that you were sympathetic, with or without a camera crew, with or without a tape recorder, with or without a still camera, it didn't really matter to them. What they cared about was getting their story out to the public. And it wasn't a political story. It was just, look what we're having to go through here. Look at what it's costing. Look at my buddies who've died. Look at us living like animals. That was what formed the basis of the cooperation between journalists and the military.
They talk freely to you, did they?
After a while, it takes a while.
Yeah.
That's why it's good to be embedded.
Yeah.
You can do the same thing in Afghanistan.
You've got to earn their trust.
Yeah. You do the same thing in Afghanistan today. The press officer will tell you what to do and not to do, Then you get in the Humvee and he doesn't come. He doesn't go on patrol. And after 2 or 3 days of patrol, the American soldiers get friends with you. And finally they talk. And if you want information, you just have to stay a long time with them. Suffer with them, sleep with them, I mean. And voila, be with them.
That priest again.
Yeah, again.
Flora, where do we hand it over to the floor now, would you say?
Actually some photographs.
Going to see Patrick's photographs first?
Yeah.
And we're going to get out of the way, aren't we?
If you like,
Yeah, I think we're going to be in the way.
Or we can duck.
I'm tired of ducking.
Duck.
You want to go that way?
Yeah.
This is Cambodia.
Can you talk us through this, Patrick?
Well, there's not much to say, but this is a Cambodian patrol. It's about 11 kilometers from Phnom Penh. It's 1974. This is just the beginning of the end for Phnom Penh. That's the one before was Vietnam. I only, took 8 pictures because it's just. This is on the road for Quan Tri.
Area of death.
That's a village that's been shelled by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. They shelled, that's Cambodian road. That's a dead Khmer Rouge. That's dead Khmer Rouge. I was with the Cambodian army and we assaulted their lines. And that's the first line of fire we stumbled on. And it was like close combat. And then we got to the second line. It is fighting in Vietnam, in the jungle.
This is after the Yanks left, eh?
Yes.
They fought well too, didn't they? The
Yeah,
South Vietnamese.
very vicious.
Incredibly brave.
This is a Cambodian photographer who would like to be somewhere else.
Great.
A lot of shooting. These American soldiers hit, wounded, waiting for evacuation. They're looking up at the helicopter coming, well, hoping he's going to come.
They were made a promise that they were never more than 20 minutes from a field hospital.
Well, you can see on their look it's been longer than that. Well, this is just my helmet.
Buddhist, eh?
Yeah, well. I still have that sign on my helmet, SSDD. Same shit, different day.
Same shit, different day.
What else is new? Voila.
Right. Thank you, Patrick. Now I think it's open to the floor. Is it, Flora? Flora to the floor.
I didn't have to put too much.
Well, this is where I become a moderator.
Can I ask you, I did my time in Vietnam, as you know, and also did other wars, and then wrote books, did other things. Why is it...
This is Stuart Dorby, by the way.
Why is it, do you feel, that Vietnam has this peculiar resonance to this day? Because if you would go anywhere, people won't talk to me about Northern Ireland, they won't talk to me about the Middle East, they'll say, well, they'll nudge their name and say, he was in Vietnam, What is the peculiarity of Vietnam?
Well, Apocalypse Now, Full Metal Jacket, Platoon aside.
Okay, good films, yeah.
Helps to keep it turning over, doesn't it? Patrick.
I think we were so good reporters that...
Every war has its great reporters, Patrick.
I know. No, I don't know why, but... Because I've been covering other wars and it's not meant much difference. Maybe it's because the American Army soldiers were so young, and there were so many reports. There was a lot of press in Vietnam, and it lasted. Very rarely you have a war that lasts that long. So there was a lot of reports, a lot of stories, a lot of good talents telling the stories, like Pierre Chenderfer. On the film of Pierre Chenderfer, you really see the American grunt, if I may call them like that. This young guy nearly falls in tears, but keeps his position. And then you see them laughing and looking at their the mail and looking at the car they're going to buy if they survive. And it's because the war was a long war and a lot of press was there and we had access, you could get deep into the heart of the soldiers without having this outside opinion saying, these guys are bad. It's easy to say this is wrong and this is right. It's much less easier when you meet the people. I have a film has just been refused on a Palestinian combat group. The French TV say they look too nice. You can't show nice terrorists. Of course they are terrorists, but they are a combat group and they are 19 and 20 years old. If there was lots of reporters reporting the Taliban, maybe you would find out that the guy, well, maybe not the Taliban, but you could find out that the guys, they have a mother also and they dream about cars. And I've been with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and some of the guys admire the Americans a lot before, in Iraq anyway. They used to dress like them, listen to the same music. Some of them were happy to see the Americans come until a bomb killed their father, and then they changed sides. But I think, to come back to Vietnam, it's because it was a long war and there was lots of press. And I'm only half joking when I'm saying we were good in reporting the story. Ireland, we've all been to Ireland. It was not easy in Ireland to make it look good, because there was not really long patrols. It was reaction forces all the time. You couldn't live with the British soldiers. What are you going to do? Just drive in a jeep up Londonderry? Or in Vietnam, you were spending 3 or 4 weeks with the army in the jungle and then going back on R&R with them. So you
Patrick,
could live with them.
I wonder whether there's such interest. It's been generated through generations, through 3 generations now, I suppose, because it was the rape of the innocents.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with it?
Well, it was the first real television war as well. Which
you mean we kept it going?
People were able to see it in a way that they hadn't seen war before, and it did go on as Patrick.
Yeah, but Stuart is asking why people, why there are so many people here tonight. Well, it's still talking about Vietnam. It happened.
Okay. It was the middle of the world then, and it was a defining moment. I mean, everyone who's grown up has realised, that this was a defining war in which America lost, and after that, the world really changed, and the way that America afterwards was never fought a war in the same way. We never let the press in the same way, like the Falklands War. It was a defining moment of how wars were covered, and I think TV does have something to do with that, and out of that has come all these films. I mean, when we first went to Vietnam, it was actually the written journalist who was in a way, sorry to say, more important than the TV journalist, because this was pre-video. This was when it was all done on film. The first reports that came out of Vietnam were done by written journalists, because the TV cameraman and the reporter would go up to the front, and we'd all go up to the front, and you would then have to ship your film back, and it wouldn't, if there was a battle on a Wednesday afternoon north of Saigon, it would be in the British newspapers the very next morning, and that would be the first that would really be known about it, if it's something really important, but it wouldn't be on the TV news until that evening.
That's true.
Sorry, I'm digressing slightly to what we were talking about.
But I wonder, and I'm sure there are Americans here, including one, I wonder whether it's managed to live longer than it should, because, like all American things, it snowballs and it snowballs and it snowballs. And it's partly part of the kind of American history that won't go away. And maybe the Americans, because of these movies, endless movies, are actually keeping it alive, keeping it in our consciousness.
I don't think that's the case, Mike.
I didn't think you would.
Respectfully, but when's the last time a new documentary or movie, Hollywood movie about Vietnam was released? It's been years. I think the fascination with Vietnam still, I agree with your point, and yours as well, is that so much truly good literature has come out of that war. Not so much the day-to-day reporting or TV news reports or magazine stuff, but some brilliant novels about the war written by GIs who were there at the time, particularly Tim O'Brien, who wrote a book called The Things We Carried, The Things They Carried, and Going After Cacciato. They're just first-rate fiction, but
it's going to a selected audience. I mean, there's no reason, you can't explain a good novel having such an effect worldwide.
That's not my point. My point was that so much good literature has come out of the Vietnam War to inform people about what it was like. So many truly dramatic stories have been told in print and in other forms. Ironically, there hasn't been a truly great poet come out of this war, even though, in my mind, the comparisons with World War I in Europe and Southeast Asia in the 60s and 70s are great. Not for the numbers of people killed so much, but the way in which the two forces, the two great alliances, fought each other to kill as many soldiers on the other side as possible. I've read a lot about World War I and know a little bit about Vietnam, and the idea that you can win a war by killing greater and greater and greater numbers of people on the other side is what makes both of those wars so tragic and ironic, because in neither case was that the solution. You know, in neither case was that either the best way to fight the war or the way to win it, if you see the object of war as winning and not losing.
Jack, I wonder if anyone here has got an answer to Stuart's question. Anyone here who could answer Stuart's question? Monsieur.
Yeah. Firstly, my name is Ante. I was reporter of Vietnam Press Agency, Saigon. I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think why you feel fascinated or why people feel Vietnam War live on, because it is the war of conscience, human conscience to me. You mentioned, Michael and Jack, that when the Americans first came to Vietnam, people in America support the war. Yes. But then, you saw a lot of things. You let people have another look, and they can think about that. They can feel that a big superpower, a Goliath, fighting a David, very small, very poor, but cannot win. Because of that, it's a source of fascinating. Secondly, because of the unbalanced or unmatched fight between two, people feel that the Americans, at the end, because they saw the reports on the television or on press through you, they saw that American forces or the Americans were not the one who deserved to be supported. That's why the Americans lost the war. And because they're so proud of themselves, they never lost the war. The loss of the Vietnam War make them feel, on the one hand, bitter. On the other hand, they, even now, maybe a number of them do not understand why they lost the war, because they do not want to face it like you have tried to show them.
Jack said that there hadn't been a recent war about Vietnam. Well, I saw Avatar. Have you seen Avatar? Avatar? Have you seen the film Avatar?
It's about Iraq. It's not about.
It's about Vietnam.
It's about Iraq. It's about Iraq.
It's about Vietnam and Iraq. Yeah.
No, I think, if I may say one thing, is first of all, I've heard a lot that the press, made the war end. I think first the Vietnamese made the war end by their heroic fight, and they resisted so long that finally the American opinion, with the help of the press, changed. But the Vietnamese had to resist that long for it to happen. So the first winner of the war are the Vietnamese people.
Yeah, sure.
And and I think why this war is so popular, maybe I'm saying something bizarre, but because I think on both sides they were heroic people. The Americans soldiers, we showed them, we went with them, they were fighting heroically. The North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were fighting heroically. Everybody was really fighting, believing, and even the Americans at the end, when they were not believing, they were standing for the man next to them. And they were heroic fights. And that makes a legend very easily. You don't have that in Iraq.
That's the word, legend. It's
become
legendary.
In Iraq, even the American soldiers I've met recently, they have a hard time believing this is right. They're doing it because it's their job, and they're doing it well, if I may say so, but there's something wrong. And plus that, they don't respect the enemy like they did of the North Vietnamese. There's no prisoners taken in Iraq or Afghanistan. There were prisoners taken on both sides in the Vietnam War. There was a slight respect of the courage of the other guy. In these recent wars, that's not happening.
Can we have another question? Sir?
I have a question, but can I just react to the...
Sure.
I'm draft age. I'm draft age American, and I don't think you can discount the fact that this was a draft war. It meant that the sons of the president of Dow faced him over the dinner table about his napalm, and every single university in America was involved in this. And so a lot of very innocent people and some fairly educated people, though there was an awful lot of fragging going on and all the rest of it, were sent to this war, and when they realized what was happening, it became an enormous creative act. This is a mercenary army we have out now. And there's a disconnect between them and American cultural society. So it makes it a very different war. It's the last war that will ever be fought, and I think that soldier was right. He said it'll be the end of wars. The question I wanted to ask, actually, is you all speak very confidently. You're my generation of the written press.
You're very sweet.
And the thousand words you were allowed and whatever. We had Julian Assange up here and Lost in Cyberspace a week and a half ago. And I asked him the question, did what he did discredit the trust in the written word? And he came out and started saying that you guys were just stenographers of power. That the people in the early stages of the war, they weren't listened to because they were actually just saying what the government expected them to say. In terms of avoiding blundering into further wars, which element of all these inventions, television, written word, now we have WikiLeaks, is likely to keep us from getting into more of these wars? We've been losing wars since Korea, one after the other. There must be something wrong with our intelligence and the way we see things as an electorate.
You've answered your own question. Jack. Can I get him to talk?
You feel like talking? I'm warming up here.
You're warming up.
Me too. Me too.
I hate silences.
None of these are going to stop wars. I mean,
we're not going to stop war.
Well, I think when
you're a great optimist if you think war could ever be stopped by the written word or television. It's the big guys who started.
If you think back a little ways, if you begin to understand the complexities of our society, of American society, and British too, for that matter, although there are many, many differences about how we get into wars. The United States, when it went to war in Vietnam to stop the global spread of communism, that that Cold War
The
attitude.
domino principle.
Yeah, if anyone in the State Department in a position of power or authority had studied Vietnamese history, they'd have known that the Chinese were their enemies for 2,000 years. Am I right? Yes. And you know, and that communist or nationalist or whatever they were, it might have been better to let them resolve the conflict themselves without getting involved the way the French did. But John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson could have had no idea that the war would escalate the way that it did. It was their arrogance, I believe, the arrogance of power and that of the people around them that led us into that horrible quagmire. Noticeably, years later, presidents like Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and even Bill Clinton got us into very limited wars. And I think each of them had more or less learned at least some of the lessons of Vietnam, that you cannot get involved. Clinton really took his time before he got involved in Yugoslavia. And with Carter, it was just that limited operation into the desert, Desert One. And with Reagan, it was Grenada and Panama, very small operations.
Salvador.
And along comes this cowboy from Texas who hasn't begun to learn the lesson of Vietnam because he's never read about it or understood what happens once you go to war. And what happens when you go to war is your soldiers become what they become. They become killers. And I mean, that's the whole idea. So you can't blame the public. I thought I caught that at the tail end of what you were saying. You can't blame the public for electing someone who is then going to appoint people he feels comfortable with to positions of, Secretary of State and all of the rest.
Thank God we didn't have a leader like that, eh?
For getting us in.
Butch, you wanted a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. A point you made, Patrick, about embedding, and you said the way to get to the soldier and to be with him and to understand him was to be embedded. Now, it seems to me, from recent evidence, that embedding is precisely what you don't want in covering conflicts.
Well, how could you cover the conflict then?
Well, with difficulty. And
It's
of course,
impossible.
Perhaps it is, but embedding is a really, to my mind, a really severe compromise because you are manipulated.
Well,
you are embedded, and therefore you are taken where they want to take you.
Yeah, but they don't decide of the attack of the enemy.
No.
They'll take you from point A to point B, but if the Taliban or the North Vietnamese attack you on the way, they don't control anything then, and you're still with the guys reacting to that attack.
Well, that's true.
And then they'll open up on you. But what are you going to do? I can't go on the North Vietnam, just walk up to the North Vietnamese because I'll end up in a jail. And so I have to be embedded, ask the South Vietnamese command if I can go with them, or the Korean, because there's some Korean troops there, or the Americans. And they'll take me. I don't have a helicopter. I can't go from this point to another point. And in Afghanistan, you have to wear a helmet and a uniform if you want to go in a helicopter. I'm not going to take my car and cross the Indian country because I'll be tied up to a pole for 1,000 days by the Taliban. Sometimes I went with the Mujahideen in Iraq, but then I'm embedded.
That's right.
I'm just not wearing a uniform, but I'm with them, and they put me underground waiting for the operation. And when the operation happens, I'm with them. And when the Americans counterattack, I'm running away with them because I'm not going to say to the Americans, peace, I was just joking. So you're always embedded.
Well,
always.
But it's
you make friends with the people. You finally this colonel from the Marines, and you become friends, and you have dinner with him in Saigon once, twice, and he'll call you and say, we're doing an operation, I'm not comfortable with it, come with us. But how do you say in English, off the record? He'll tell you things, and if you're a good journalist, you obey to that ethic, because that ethic will get you to better places. You know,
But
you're always embedded.
You want to say something? I was just going to say that what we're all doing really is getting a snapshot of the war, which leads to a greater truth in a way, and a better
with several
and a bigger understanding. And so you might be embedded. You will see the war from the American side, and if we're talking about Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, there is some event you photograph, you write about, which tells you something about how that war is being fought from that particular aspect, and then you go and do something else, and you build up a picture. You go to Kabul, or you go to,
I understand that.
Which every time we got into a helicopter in Vietnam, we were voluntarily embedding ourselves.
Sure.
Weren't we?
Yeah.
But there's reporters everywhere. There was reporters on the North Vietnamese side. There was reporters everywhere.
I think embedding got a bad name
it's got a dirty connotation.
Desert Storm.
Yeah, but that's just for that operation. Even then, there was the other group, it was called the FDP.
We were the unilaterals. We were the unilaterals.
Another question.
It was called Fuck the Pool.
Okay, thank you.
And so, you have reporters everywhere. You had Vietnamese reporters working with us too,
There's a question over
yes,
here.
a couple of questions in one. You mentioned Michael Herr's book and about the party and the wildlife in Saigon, but his book also covers the sort of the after effect and the come down from the party. And it's also in Anthony Lloyd's book. I mean, you guys must have seen a lot of death and devastation in the country. What kind of impacts it had on you? And also mentioned a lot about the films that have kind of made this war so prominent. What film do you think best sums up what Vietnam was for you guys?
Short and sweet.
I haven't seen anything that's come out of Hollywood that approaches what the experience was like. If you want to spend $12 for a paperback, The Cat from Hue is my 850-page memoir about the hell of
a lot of sexy pictures
of it. I mean, it's on Amazon. You
better rush. There are very few copies left.
But I go into that in great depth. Really, what the effect. Also, long smoke-filled rooms. Long pages of descriptions of what those smoke-filled rooms were like in Saigon, and all those friends who were. I think there were more than two basic kinds of reporters.
Short and sweet, but Jack.
There were the straights, who like John and Michael, who didn't do drugs and filed their copy or shipped their film and wrote conventionally, and then there were the crazies, and that's what the straights called us. The crazies were the ones who smoked dope, but not in the field, although Page could smoke dope anywhere, even when he was asleep, I think.
Came out of his ears.
It was just another way of relaxing, to my mind. But to be high in the field was insane. It really was. I mean, those soldiers who went over the top in the trenches in World War I with their stomachs full of rum or whatever it was they gave them needed it. The Americans, and the press used marijuana, I think, to relax in rear areas. I never saw any guys.
But you see, Jack, this is Michael Herr in his book, and you said there was no poetry written about Vietnam. Michael Herr's writing is poetry.
Yeah.
And he says that everywhere he went, the guys were on something. And yet, Jack spent a lot of time with these guys, and he says they weren't.
Mike went to a lot of rear area bases, and I went to a lot of forward line units.
But you're still talking about the sort of the high times and what have you. What about Has there been any sort of after effects when you came back? Have you been affected by that?
I'll tell you if I can.
Who's moderating here?
Full Metal Jacket. You remember that? It was a true story of a sniper in Way, I think it was. The Marines are going into a place, and one is killed, and the Marine goes out, and then he's shot, and another one goes out, and he's shot. And when they eventually killed the sniper, she was a very beautiful lady dressed in black. Well, I actually met that sniper in Hanoi. He was blinded and his face was disfigured because shot, and he'd actually described to me how he had shot 5 Marines, one after the other, as they'd gone out to collect the body. Now, one of the reasons, in a way, to answer Stuart's, is it's been so romanticized, Vietnam. It has become this great romantic legend. And it won't be long before there's another movie about Vietnam. It has been promulgated as almost some kind of romantic legend, when, as we know, it was a pretty filthy war.
To answer your question,
it was romantic.
A number of journalists have committed suicide. That should be remembered. Almost none of my friends doesn't have some of the symptoms of PTSD. Whether it's drinking too much or talking too much or
I'm doing both.
Yeah, I think.
I think if you believe in what you're doing, really, you don't have this trauma. I don't have
PTSD.
Yeah.
PTSD.
I think if you still believe that what you did is right or is useful, it helps.
You don't see those images that you took?
No. I don't see them as what?
You don't see the images that you took in the middle of the night. You don't have nightmares about what you've seen.
Not at all, no.
Yeah. No,
because I keep...
You close the curtain, don't you?
Well, the war's still on for me. It's Afghanistan, Iraq, Bangkok, Salvador, Nicaragua. When the war will end, maybe I will have bad dreams, but that'll be in about 3,000 years.
But I can think of about 10 journalists I know who covered Vietnam who committed suicide, which is an astonishing figure, actually.
Saigon Blues.
Afterwards, one guy jumped off a roof in Johannesburg. I won't go through them all, but it is an example of how difficult it was to come off that, if I use the phrase adrenaline high, of covering that conflict ceaselessly, day in, day out, and then it all coming to an end and actually not being able to replace it with something else, and getting very miserable about it, and getting very, very miserable about some of the things you've seen.
I mean, there's a thing called combat stress in this country, looking after fellows who come back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's the coming back that kills them. Having done what they've done, suddenly to come back to live in number 17 Fitzstevens Road, Banbury, and then go to work as a postman.
That's documented in the Lloyd book.
I mean, this is what crushes them in the end. And I've done a number of stories on guys who simply can't cope. Majority do. I mean, I was in the Falklands War and met a lot of the guys afterwards. 1 out of 10 couldn't cope. The others somehow managed to get back into it. So I think it's just a personal thing, isn't it? You either can or you can't. Those who can't kill themselves.
But is that partly
Glib, isn't it? But I think that's the truth.
Is that partly because we weren't?
Sorry, you've had your choice, Stuart. Can we have another one?
Thank you. My question kind of comes on to something we've already talked about. I think it was John Paul Vann called the Vietnam War a bright, shining lie. And I want to know whether you think, as journalists, that the American military might have lost the Vietnam War, but was it a victory for the media? Was it something you can say, in terms of holding power to account, you won? Or is it simply the fact that the odds are stacked against you to such a point that it can never really be that way? I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
It's the Vietnamese that won the war.
I think it would be wrong to characterize the American press corps in Vietnam at any period as being anti-war.
I think we're talking about the international press corps.
Yeah. But American public opinion didn't change because journalists were feeding them a lot of anti-war stories. That's not true. In fact, they've done some studies that show that 90% or more of the American press coverage, including TV and magazines and the rest, was either pro-military or neutral during the war. It really was the Tet Offensive that made people sit up in 1968, in March of 68, and begin to question the leadership in Washington, because it had been predicting both the military and the civilian leadership. It had been predicting the end for the opposition, for the North Vietnamese and the VC, and once people began to doubt whether the war was winnable, or whether it was a long, continuous stalemate, or would be, they began marching in greater and greater numbers. For me, the turning point was when my mother, whose kid brother was an Air Force pilot in Vietnam, started wearing a button that said "Mothers Against the War." That was the turning point for me, and actually took part in a demonstration in the United States. It's wrong to blame the press or to say it was a victory for the press, right? Although Vo-en Giap, the general who commanded the North Vietnamese army, has been quoted as saying, the only victors in this war were the media. You know, I mean, we're the only ones who came out with our reputations reasonably intact. I think that's what he meant.
Does anyone disagree there?
Well, I don't think it was a great victory for us as well, because, if I might say so,
Do go ahead.
once the Americans left in 1973, the American press itself bought the line that basically the war was over because no more Americans were being killed, and the American press, which had been huge, diminished, and that wasn't obviously there was cost cutting and all that sort of stuff, but Vietnam was then over. Everyone wanted to think that it was over, and so there were much smaller bureaus. It wasn't covered at all in the same way, and in the first year, from 73 to 74, when the Americans weren't fighting, another 100,000 Vietnamese were killed, but it was sort of forgotten. And I think that those of us who were still around in those days really sort of remembered and continued to try and cover the war. When the war finally ended in 1975, again, you know, masses of journalists who had covered that war came, and then they left as well because they were leaving with the last Americans. And Vietnam itself, and it was a war about Vietnamese people, and a country called Vietnam tended to get slightly forgotten in all of that. And I think that we as the press overall were not that great in that respect, and therefore it wasn't a great
Patrick, can I just just going? I know we're running out of time, but or are we? I don't know. Was the French war in Vietnam as thoroughly covered as the American war in Vietnam by the French in the French media?
Well, it was covered by war correspondents. They were integrated into the army.
Was it as big? Did it get the kind of massive coverage that in France as it got it as Vietnam did in America?
The French people didn't want to hear about this war. There was demonstrations against the war in France too, in those days. And Pierre Chendorfer was embedded at 23 years old in Vietnam, in Indochina, as they called it then, and to replace a cameraman that was killed. But he had a military contract as a civilian to cover the war for the army.
But he didn't get the same kind, anywhere near the same kind of blanket coverage that.
Well, he covered everything, much more than any outside journalist. But some outside journalists were next to him, covering the same thing. In Dien Bien Phu, they were reporting the great disaster.
But the French public weren't as entranced as the American public were.
Well, they were following that battle closely. I mean, Dien Bien Phu was like a football match being watched from far away by the French.
You know. We have another question, please. Madame. Or mademoiselle.
Mademoiselle.
Pardon.
Thank I was thinking about Daniel Ellsberg. You remember him? And this guy who was working in Pentagon.
Pentagon Papers.
Yeah. And you are, as a reporter, you try to find, I'm going to say a strange word, but you try to report the truth about what happened on battlefields. And what do you think about those men who try to understand what happened, but in Washington and those places? Because he made something important to try to say that the war could stop earlier, you know? So where can we find the truth about war? On the battlefields or in the place where the war are decided?
Cool. Blimey. Anyone like to answer that?
Each of us, whether we were in the war or not, whether we saw something in the newspaper or read a book about a war, whether we fought a war or not, each of us has our own truth. Okay? And that, for me, is a synthesis of all that I've seen and read and written, because you always get closer to your own personal truth by writing about it. Yeah? And I spent 30 years working on this $12 book that you can get on Amazon.
but hurry.
It's running. I joke about it now, but it was a serious endeavor. During the war, everything is distorted. The first casualty is truth. I disagree with Philip. I think the first casualty is morality. I think that dies first, and then the truth about how morally or not people behave. So your truth and my truth, and the gentleman's truth, maybe marginally different, maybe hugely different, but it's based on our experiences. The American public, enough members of the American public decided, as had members of the British public and French public long before, I suspect, or at least a majority of them, that the Vietnam War, there was something wrong. That expression that you heard from the soldiers, wrong war, wrong place, wrong time.
You're wrong there, if I could. The British public really were pretty ambivalent about the Vietnam War. It was just a generation thing. The demonstrations were done by students. You didn't have grown-up people as you did during the Countryside Alliance March, the anti-Iraq March, when you had 1 million people on the street of all ages in London protesting about Iraq. You never had that kind of commotion in London about Vietnam. It was the kids who were on the campuses and in Berkeley, Grosvenor Square. So the British public during the Vietnam War were pretty laid back about it, believe me.
I was basing what I said on the behavior of the British governments at the time. And it was very cool.
That's right.
It was not supportive of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. But anyway,
we're agreeing, I think.
Yes. Do you see my point? Our individual truths are what matter. But in the case of the American public, with such a long war, as Patrick points out, and as Michael points out, being seen in a way that a war had not been seen in the American public before, so many stories, in so many ways, and graphic violence that had been edited out or censored in previous wars was being seen, and it's very hard to take. If you're seeing something horrific like the pictures of little Phuc, who suffered those burns, or things like that in still photography and in television coverage, week after week after, it wasn't night after night, because that was extraordinary, but there was something every week, more or less, that was shocking, and it has a cumulative effect, I think, on a public.
I think the victory of the press is that now, in the État-Major, how do you say?
High Command.
High Command, what they don't want to see is the pictures of Vietnam again. What the public does not want to see and suffer and the young people go to a war is because of the images, of the writing, of the footage of Vietnam. It's right there. It still is there. And this is maybe our only victory, is to keep that in mind. The people are afraid to see another burned young woman. They don't want to see. And what is it? It's an image of this young girl that they don't want to see. Okay, they saw other things. Now they saw Abu Ghraib and they saw things like that. But it's always a reporter who tells a story that goes on and on for the years. We don't only work for the news, we work for the memory also. And that's where maybe our only victory is after us.
There is a phrase, isn't there, compassion fatigue. And it's a great couple of words, compassion fatigue. And I think the British public and the American public in Vietnam suffered immense compassion fatigue. We did in Northern Ireland. There came a point where we hardly ever covered Northern Ireland again. A bomb went off, so what? It's another bomb. But I think we shouldn't go overboard here. There are lots of Americans here. And one very famous one who's written a fantastic book called The Cat.
Bless you.
$12 on Amazon.
Getting cheaper.
You know, I sometimes do little lectures and talks and things, but people don't remember me from Vietnam. They remember me from the Falklands,
sure,
because that was our Vietnam in a way. That was a British war concerning Brits, my people. Your war was about your people, and the impact in your country much greater than it was in my country. Therefore, our memories I think have faded. It may not be fading that fast in your country, but our memory of war is 1982, when we buggered the Argies, right? And that's what we remember. That's who I'm remembered by, even though I spent all those years covering other wars. So I think we should bear that in mind, that this is an American war, it's in the American conscience, and it's being, I suppose, as I said, continually snowballing by Americans. Doesn't that sound dreadful? Xenophobic. Sir, over the top there.
Yes, can I just raise the issue of should we be addressing the period of American involvement as the American war, or should we actually be trying to be 360 degrees in viewing the process, and bear in mind that for the Vietnamese this was just a mere episode in a much, much longer struggle for independence that in militaristic terms began with the Japanese occupation, the betrayal by the British under General Rose, then the defeat of the French and partial liberation in the north. And after the departure of the Americans, let's not forget it was the Vietnamese that sorted out Pol Pot and then dealt in the north with the Chinese attempt to invade in retaliation. So if we're looking at it from 360 degrees, the American involvement in Vietnam was merely a short period in time of what was, for the Vietnamese, a much, much longer struggle for national self-determination, which arguably is still going on today because the political process of unification and healing the divisions of the previous generations is something the Vietnamese are now sorting out for themselves.
I think we'll all agree with that one anyway. Yes, I think we agree. Another question, please. Sir. Sorry.
Thank you. Given everything that you saw happen in that long and brutal war, what you think of the curious sort of transformation and yet non-transformation that Vietnam's gone through since, in that it's still a single-party communist state, but they now have naval exercises with America. America's doing nuclear negotiations with Vietnam, and for lots of my generation, Vietnam is more about backpacking and holidays and things like that than the war. And I just wondered, from your perspective of seeing that war, what you think of what it is now.
Well, Jonathan, of course, one of the reasons we've got this meeting is that John wrote an article for the magazine, and he has recently been there. So, John, it's up to you to tell us how Vietnam has recovered.
Well, we start with Saigon, places which all of us know very well. there are buildings that have been ripped down, and there are now skyscrapers up there with Louis Vuitton shops and the Prada and this sort of thing. And I'm quoting a friend of mine, Jim Pringle. We all wonder whether these Viet Cong, who fought so bravely for the communist cause in the South, and leaving aside the North Vietnamese army, who now dominate the country, or the North Vietnamese dominate the country, but the Viet Cong, who fought as an indigenous communist force in the South, whether they are actually fighting for Louis Vuitton and Prada shops in the heart of the capital. It's become a sort of a capitalist paradise in that respect, but it is dominated by a communist party which is still very, very much in control.
But the building in there is amazing. The kind of development that's going on there is astonishing.
So in the dollar is king. I mean, the dollar is king in Vietnam. You could say, therefore, at the end of the day, actually the Americans have won, but the end result might have been the same, but saving 2 to 3 million lives.
There was a wonderful piece on ITN I saw in the late 80s, maybe early 90s, but it was when the US and Vietnam were starting to have more comfortable relations, diplomatic relations, and this wonderful piece on ITN. I was watching at home.
Don't forget that book, will you?
It's in the book, this piece. It says,
I got a book too.
Anyway, I think President Clinton had appointed a trade ambassador to Hanoi. And ITN had done a story about the new capitalism in Vietnam under a communist regime, a single party state, and quite authoritarian too. And there was this American guy who was a veteran of the war. Okay, he had been an officer in the American Air Force or Army or something, and he's being interviewed in his office, and you see all these pictures of 4-star hotels and people water skiing on the lake of reunification, and Japanese business people and Chinese business people and a roaring economy, and the ambassador looks into the camera and said, I think it would have been a lot easier if they just let us win.
Another question, please. Sir.
You've already been touching on this somewhat, but thank you. You've been touching on this all along, but I was hoping you could say some more about how the job of reporting on war, the practicalities and the consequences, is different now.
Well, in TV terms, of course. Where's Butch gone? He's at the end. As John said, in the old days in TV, a lot of the time I had a French crew, and my French is very bad, so we had an agreement that we would speak English in the morning and French in the afternoon, and I knew that we had to catch a flight by 1 o'clock. So, but in practical terms, I had to catch that flight. And that flight then went to Bangkok or to Hong Kong, where the film was then processed and then satellited to London. And if I missed that flight, then my story was history. Today, of course, I can satellite, well, not me, but the new generation can satellite from the spot, can't they? So in TV terms, if we'd had it then, life would have been so much simpler. During the Falklands War, we could have had the facility to satellite from the ships. But the Royal Navy being, dinosaur is quite a modern invention term to apply to the Royal Navy, but they just simply wouldn't allow us to do so. And our reports took a long time to get back, as you know, longer than it did for William Russell to send reports back from the Crimea War.
But yours are better.
What?
Yours are better.
So in TV terms, if we'd had satellites, my God, we could have been doing this kind of stuff live from the field. these guys were always, as John said, always ahead of us because they could just file copy over.
Oh, well, we couldn't. I mean, the big change is the communications. You're completely right. But I mean, we used to have a nightmare trying to get our stories out. I mean, you'd be sitting on the biggest story of the world, or the biggest battle in Vietnam. But if you couldn't actually file your copy, what was the point of it? Or get your photographs out? I mean, today, you have mobile phones, you have satellite communications. Your office is going to badger you wherever you are with your mobile phone, asking you to update things. Whereas in those days, you could actually, spend time in the field. You could get your material, and then it was the biggest battle to actually find a way to get it out, and find a telephone line that worked, get back to Saigon, or, yeah, and then you find some Italian writing a libretto on the single telex, and he's dominating it, and you have to pull him off. Anyway,
may I just say that apart from the communications, which is the biggest difference, to go back to your question, for me, the biggest difference is the change in the attitude of the American military toward journalists. Okay, when I was in Vietnam, it was all buddy-buddy, and you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, and just keep this quiet, Jack, but such and such is going on. For example, a Marine revealed to me privately that they had brought in nuclear weapons during the siege of Quezon in 1967, 68. And today, we're looked at with great suspicion, okay, from the high command down to the average soldier, to the private. And the suspicion is that somehow we're going to misrepresent what's going on. We're going to portray them as baby killers, which has happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, and heathens and butchers. So at higher levels, the press, American press, foreign press, is officially seen as neutral, like as they put it, like the terrain. The terrain is neutral, okay? And there are no, everything is on the record. Whatever you see or photograph or anyone says is on the record. And you actually sign a multi-page declaration to the military agreeing to their ground rules that everything is on the record, what you say and what they say and what they do. But it's all about how well they know you. Patrick has told me a few minutes ago that he's just been accepted to be embedded with a cavalry unit in Afghanistan for 3 weeks in October, which means that they trust him to a degree, and it's probably his long track record going all the way back to Vietnam and the work that he's done. He's not seen as some kind of subversive who's going to embed with them and then write the most negative possible story. When a friend of mine is a colonel in the American Army in the States, and when he heard that General McChrystal had allowed a Rolling Stone reporter to witness the kind of idle chat that goes on in a 4-star general's entourage, he said, excuse me for this, fucking Rolling Stone? Exclamation points. Don't you know any better, General, than to talk freely in front of this guy? So,
Patrick, you had the problem. You would have had the same problems as me in Vietnam, trying to get your pictures out on the same day.
Yeah. Well, I had problems getting my pictures out for the last 40 years. I bought lots of donkeys and horses and things like that to get the pictures out.
But how you ship them out by plane or?
Well, yeah. Usually you could find a taxi driver and put the films in his trunk and hope they're not going to get lost in 3 days of driving to go to the other next country. In Vietnam it was different. I was selling my pictures directly to AP or.
But how did you get them out?
They got them out. I didn't care.
But how did they get them out?
I don't know.
I don't believe that.
I would go to
Come on.
Saigon, just give my pictures.
Least line.
They would just give me four rolls of film, and I would go back. I think what has changed, well, for the French, not much has changed. We've always been suspicious. With
Especially
any
of
army.
us.
Yeah. But what has changed is the perception of the fighter of us, and their own perception. I'm trying to make sense here. Like before, when you take a picture of somebody, a fighter or a rebel or whatever, he didn't know exactly what you were using as a camera, and he didn't know what he was going to look like. He was just being himself. Today I have actors in front of me. They all have the same camera as I have. They know how to use it. They film each other all the time with their phones, with their cameras. If I I could go to Afghanistan without a camera. I'll just ask a soldier to give me his. Everybody has a camera today. And before I would say to the people, I will send you some pictures, maybe 6 months later, if you're not dead, you know. Last time I went back to Palestine, I had done a film on the Palestinians. And I came with some DVDs to give it to them. And the guys had already seen the film. And one guy had changed his hairstyle because he didn't. Two of them went on a diet.
Oh, great.
And they already had the criticism of my film. I mean, it's like, you know, they know who you are, they know what you're doing. Before, they didn't. So they're not as, you have to be really careful on how the people perceive or use you. I'm not worried of what I'm not allowed to do today. I'm worried, why am I allowed to do this? Who's using me? You know. But why our work still works is because we're a lot of press guys. So you can have one guy in the south of Afghanistan, one in the north, one embedded, one with the Mujahideen, and all this press comes to one point, and it's a teamwork. And what's going to happen in your newspaper or your TV, people get images of everybody, and there's one man who's going to say, this looks real, let's mix this, and let's try to balance and tell the truth. Yeah. It's not the work of one man anymore.
That's right.
It's a teamwork.
You know, the difference between TV now and TV then was when you left Saigon in the morning with your crew, you went to do a story, right? I mean, we used to look for the war. We'd look in the sky and see an airstrike and say, that's where we got to go, right? And we'd just drive until we got there. And usually something happened on the way that kind of was better than the airstrike. And when you sent it back, it was your story. That was your cut, or at least your footage, and it was your commentary. And when it got to London, they showed it as your report. Today, if I do I don't do stories anymore, but up until fairly recently, out of a 2-minute news bulletin, I'd probably have a stand-upper, right? Perhaps a bit of an interview, and maybe 15 seconds of my own footage. The rest would come from ABC, CBS, French television, Al Jazeera. It would be a potpourri that we gather. And we don't know who shot this stuff. We don't know if it's authentic, but it's good. And it makes a story better. And that's the difference. Our stories are no longer our stories. They're what the producer back in town decides will make the best picture. So in a way, we've surrendered our integrity for entertaining television. Enough said. Oh yes, Patrick has brought with him, unexpectedly I think, some remarkable film of, after Patrick, one of the greatest photographers in Vietnam, Larry Burrows.
An interview of Larry Burrows.
Yeah, he was an English photographer, worked for Life magazine, and probably one of the gentlest men you'd ever expect to meet. When I went there, he was, and I'd never been there before. I was young, and he actually put his arm around and said, "No, you know, you've got to do this, and you must be careful with it. He was such a gentle guy, and yet he shot some of the most fantastic pictures of the entire war. And he
best photographer in Vietnam.
Yeah, he was killed in a helicopter attack in Laos. So I think we're going to move out of the way and vacate the stage. None of us have seen this, so we're, oops-a-daisy.
There was one particular story which was called One Ride with Yankee Papa 13, which involved 17 helicopters, 4 of which were shot down, and quite a lot of people were killed and wounded. And we tried to rescue a pilot off a ship. We landed alongside a co-pilot from this downed ship, wounded. The co-pilot that had climbed onto our ship had 2 bullet holes. One in the arm, one in the leg, one we hadn't noticed, which was the third one, which was just under the armpit, and he died. And it was a very sad moment, a very touching moment, when our crew chief broke down and cried. And everybody was very tense because everybody had suffered through it. And so often I wonder whether it is my right to capitalize, as I feel so often, on the grief of others. But then I justify my own particular thoughts by feeling that if I can contribute a little to the understanding of what others are going through, then there's a reason for doing it. You can't let yourself think.
6, keep your 2 pop.
Can't go out. As you see people, a hill near the DMZ not so long ago, when suddenly, it was just after 5 o'clock as a matter of fact, in came some 122 rockets. People that you were seen alive a few minutes ago suddenly were dead. And you realize that it could have been you.
The work that was being done by the photographers there shaped the opinion of the American public, showed us what was really happening to the average person in Vietnam. They went way beyond politics. In fact, they showed us where the politicians and military leaders were lying to us. They held them accountable for their policies in human terms, and it was unacceptable. Simply by documenting, they created a form of protest, which I think changed the course of history. I think it allowed America to get out of that war much sooner than it would have otherwise if there had been no coverage at all. And the work that was done by those photographers inspired me to become a photographer.
Harry always had that right turn. That's it, huh? Well, I think, Flora, that's it, isn't it? I think we just have to thank...
I just want to thank you, all of you. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us tonight. It was a fascinating discussion.
Well, and thanks for a very nice audience. Thanks for being here.